same kind of audience, some young, but basically middle.
Johnnie Taylor, the voice known as the philosopher of soul, once moved millions with sorrowful love songs and raw confessions so painfully real they could cut to the bone. Over more than 50 years of music, from sacred gospel to aching soul, he was more than an artist. He was a witness to love, betrayal, loss, and survival in a harsh musical world. He is remembered for hits like Who's Making Love Cheaper to Keep Her and Disco Lady, but few know this behind the charming smile was a man carrying silent wounds, from friends, colleagues, mentors, and even his own flesh and blood. Before he passed, Johnnie Taylor left no memoirs. But if we piece together the forgotten stories from backstage recording studios, and a few things he let slip in interviews, we begin to see there were 10 names he could never shake from his conscience. Who were they? And why did just one moment with each of them leave a sadness that echoed through the rest of his life? The first ones to leave Johnnie Taylor. Among all the wounds he carried, none haunted Johnnie Taylor more than those inflicted by the ones who once sang beside him, only to turn away when he fell. Not enemies, not rivals, but brothers in faith. Men who once stood with Johnnie beneath the vaulted ceilings of churches sharing hymns and breaths of the Lord. In 1957, at the age of 23, Johnnie Taylor was given a rare opportunity to replace none other than Sam Cooke as the lead singer of the legendary gospel group The Soul Stirrers. It wasn't just a career leap, it was a validation of spiritual and musical worth for a young black man raised in the tradition of Southern gospel, where singing was not just art, but calling. Dressed in a pastor's robe and carrying a voice filled with conviction, Johnnie traveled with the group to churches and community halls across the South, bringing sacred songs that moved congregations to tears. But just 3 years later, in 1960, that door shut painfully. One fateful evening, Johnnie was driving while fatigued, or according to some sources, possibly under the influence of marijuana, and caused an accident that resulted in the death of a young girl. That unintentional tragedy left a scar not only on his soul, but also on his bond with the members of the Soul Stirrers. Instead of support, Johnnie was dismissed from the group, the official reason being to preserve the reputation of gospel music and the faith community. The decision wasn't made public with fanfare, but to Johnnie it felt like an exile from the holiest home he had ever known. There was no farewell, no arms of comfort, only silence from those who once sang together of mercy, now avoiding him because of a mistake that could never be undone. In a rare moment of reflection, Johnnie said simply, "I learned that the church isn't always a place you can come home to." Johnnie Taylor's first response wasn't to fight back. He didn't go to the press, didn't badmouth anyone, didn't file complaints. Instead, he withdrew, quietly, in pain, and lost. His musical journey veered in a completely new direction, from church to stage, from gospel to R&B. Some say that without the accident and rejection, there would be no Who's Making Love or Disco Lady. But in exchange, Johnnie lost a part of himself. The part that believed in unconditional forgiveness from those who claimed to worship the same God. The story of Johnnie Taylor and the Soul Stirrers wasn't just a musical split. It was a reflection of something deeper, the fragile line between faith and judgment, between the sacred and the human. In the gospel world, an artist is not only expected to sing, but to bear a moral standard. And sometimes that expectation becomes so heavy, there's no room left for human flaws. But is the artist born to carry perfect responsibility? Or do they too deserve the right to fall and rise again? Johnnie Taylor never spoke ill of the Soul Stirrers. He didn't need to. His silence and the path he chose afterward, one that left the church behind but never let go of the soul, was his answer. In his voice, the gospel could still be heard, but it was no longer bound by doctrine. Isaac Hayes, the giant shadow that made Johnnie Taylor walk away quietly. On the list of people Johnnie Taylor eventually chose not to work with anymore, Isaac Hayes was the second name, and perhaps the one that left him feeling the most in awe, yet quietly stung. Because Isaac wasn't an enemy nor a villain. He was the kind of person Johnnie simply couldn't hate, but also couldn't help but feel eclipsed by. A talent too immense, a presence too blinding. And within that very brilliance, Johnnie's own career, despite its many achievements, slowly began to fade into the background. In 1966, when Johnnie Taylor officially joined Stax Records, the sacred ground of Memphis soul, he was seen as a central figure to help fill the void left by Otis Redding after his tragic plane crash in 1967. Johnnie already had the perfect voice for smooth R&B, years of stage experience, and the charisma needed to become the label's next leading man. In fact, just 1 year later, he made a powerful mark with the hit Who's Making Love 1968, which sold over 1 million singles. A remarkable feat for soul music at the time. But as the label began to recover, a new musical current emerged at Stax: the rise of Isaac Hayes, a producer, composer, and multifaceted performer. Isaac wrote, arranged, and recorded bold cinematic albums unlike anything before. With his shaved head, dark shades, deep voice, and hauntingly long grooves, Isaac Hayes quickly became the face of a new Stax era. And from that moment, the label shifted direction, throwing its full weight behind Hayes and his grand progressive soul style. Johnnie Taylor, once Stax's brightest star, was slowly pushed to the sidelines. His albums continued to release steadily, and he still landed charting singles, but the media attention, marketing budgets, and touring schedules all leaned toward Isaac Hayes. Within the company, whispers spread Isaac is the now and the future, while Johnnie was seen as the past trying to hold on. Though never officially cast aside, Johnnie understood clearly, favoritism doesn't always need to be announced. Sometimes silence and one-sided attention are enough. Johnnie Taylor never publicly criticized Hayes. In fact, he continued to show respect for his colleague, as great artists often do for one another. But in a rare interview in the late 1980s, when asked about his time at Stax, Johnnie simply replied, "I know exactly who I am, but the label didn't always remember that." A soft-spoken sentence, yet laced with bitterness. Johnnie's response wasn't resentment, but creativity. In 1973, he released Tailored in Silk, a pure soul masterpiece, rich in soft strings, delicate arrangements, and deeply emotional lyrics. It was Johnnie Taylor's answer to the label, to the public, and perhaps to Isaac Hayes himself, that he hadn't lost his identity, even if he'd been forgotten in the label's pecking order. But by 1975, as Stax began facing financial troubles, Johnnie chose to leave. No drama, no lawsuits, just a quiet packing of bags, leaving behind the place that had been both his launchpad and the source of his most painful overshadowing. The story between Johnnie Taylor and Isaac Hayes wasn't one of hatred, but a timeless tale of the creative world, where two flames burn in the same room and one inevitably gets dimmed. One artist's rise can unintentionally cast a shadow over another, not out of malice, but simply because they shone brighter at the right moment. Don Davis, the producer who made him record the song he hated most. When it comes to the people who left the deepest marks on Johnnie Taylor's career, Don Davis is a name that cannot be left out. Not because he betrayed, deceived, or exploited Johnnie in the usual sense, but because Don was the one who put Johnnie in a position where he had to compromise his identity and ultimately achieved fame through a song he didn't even love. The story takes place in 1968, a turning point for both Johnnie and Stax Records. Following Otis Redding's sudden death in 1967 and the collapse of the label's distribution deal with Atlantic Records, Stax was forced to rebuild its entire catalog and redefine its artist direction. As part of this effort, Don Davis, a young producer from Detroit, was brought to Memphis to inject new energy, blending traditional soul with the catchy sensibilities of Motown. Don Davis was sharp. He saw in Johnnie Taylor a nearly perfect voice full of emotion rooted in gospel, yet flexible enough to handle modern funk. But Johnnie, long accustomed to slow, introspective ballads, was reluctant to modernize in Davis's style. Their musical tension became clear when Don handed Johnnie a track titled Who's Making Love. With its fast funk tempo, thick backing vocals, and lyrics poking fun at cheating men getting their comeuppance, the song was far from Johnnie's usual taste. He once described it as a loud boogity-boogity number, lacking the emotional depth he longed to express. At first, Johnnie refused to record it. He thought it was cheap and not in line with the kind of artist I want to be. But Don Davis was firm. In a meeting at Stax, Davis said bluntly, "You don't have to like the song. You just need to let the audience like it." That soft pressure, part persuasion, part commercial strategy placed Johnnie at a difficult crossroads: preserve his artistic identity or adapt to survive in a shifting market. In the end, he gave in. And as fate often is, Who's Making Love became the biggest hit of Johnnie Taylor's career at the time. #1 on the R&B chart, #5 on the Billboard Hot 100, and over 1 million singles sold. It earned him the title Philosopher of Soul. The success was undeniable, and even left Johnnie conflicted. Because deep down he still didn't like the song. Years later, in a conversation with a colleague, Johnnie admitted he still referred to the track as the song I sing with a forced smile. It put him on the map, but also stamped him as the guy who sings about cheating men when he had always hoped to be remembered as a true soul artist. Introspective, thoughtful, spiritually deep. This episode raises a tough question. Does artistic success still hold its full value if the artist doesn't feel proud of it? And if the applause comes from something you don't believe in, is that truly a victory? Johnnie Taylor didn't hate Don Davis as a villain. On the contrary, he always acknowledged the man's talent and sharp instincts. But between them lay a quiet fracture. One man wanting to create on his own terms, the other having to accept success delivered in someone else's language. It was a subtle clash hard to name, not animosity, but a wound that never quite healed in their collaboration. And perhaps that's why, after Who's Making Love, Johnnie began to demand more control over his recordings, leading to future clashes with the label, with collaborators, and with those who cast unwanted shadows over his art. Little Johnnie Taylor, the name mix-up that haunted his career. In the world of music, there are fiery rivalries and creative disagreements. But sometimes the deepest wounds come from something seemingly harmless, a name. For Johnnie Taylor, a man who spent his life building his identity in soul and R&B, the name Little Johnnie Taylor was one of the most exhausting, frustrating, and helpless challenges he ever faced in his career. Born in 1934 in Crawfordsville, Arkansas, Johnnie Taylor grew up surrounded by gospel choirs, church services, and the preaching of pastors. When he transitioned into secular music, he kept his real name. No flashy stage persona, no add-ons. Just Johnnie Taylor, simple, direct, and self-assured. But ironically, just as he was building his solo career, another Johnnie Taylor unexpectedly burst onto the scene and took the spotlight. Little Johnnie Taylor, born in 1943, had no relation to Johnnie, but chose a stage name nearly identical, only adding little in front. In the early 1960s, while Johnnie Taylor was still trying to transition from gospel to R&B, Little Johnnie scored big with the hit Part-Time Love 1963, which topped the R&B charts and cracked the Billboard Hot 100's top 20. For the general public, especially black audiences in the South and Southwest, the name Johnnie Taylor suddenly became associated with that hit song. Even though the singer wasn't the real Johnnie, Johnnie Taylor once shared that throughout the mid-60s, he was constantly mistaken as the artist behind Part-Time Love. DJs, promoters, even audiences introduced him as the guy with that hit, though he'd never performed it live. At first he found it odd, but soon it turned bitter. All his efforts to carve out a soulful, emotional identity were suddenly blurred by a name mix-up and a musical style that wasn't even his. So how did Johnnie Taylor respond? First with silence, then by taking the song back. In a move that was both clever and assertive, he began performing Part-Time Love in his shows, and even recorded his own version for the album Raw Blues. He never denied the existence of Little Johnnie Taylor, but he also refused to let someone else's name define him. In a rare comment, he said frankly, "If he took my name, then I'll take his song. Fair's fair." It wasn't an act of war, but a reclaiming of identity in an industry where names matter more than most people realize. For Johnnie Taylor, what hurt wasn't the fame of Little Johnnie. It was being misunderstood. He fought for years to be known for Cheaper to Keep Her Disco Lady or I Believe in You, not for a hit he didn't write, didn't love, and never felt reflected who he was. This story opens a broader lens on the American music industry of that era, where black artists often lacked legal protection for personal branding and intellectual identity. Sharing a name didn't just cause confusion, it affected income, reputation, and long-term career paths. Especially for artists without mainstream media backing, just securing a place with your own name was already a quiet battle. Can the public be discerning enough to tell apart two artists with the same name? Can one artist's success unintentionally overshadow another's fight for individuality? Those questions didn't end in the 60s. They're still relevant today in a world where personal brand is everything. For Johnnie Taylor, this was a small but deep chapter. A persistent irritation he rarely spoke about but always carried with him as a quiet reminder. Make sure people know who you are before someone else decides for you. And just as he finally stepped out from under the shadow of Little Johnnie, a far greater shadow began to cover him. Not about a name, but about musical power. A friend, a colleague, a towering figure Stax Records placed all its hopes on. Someone who would make Johnnie record a song he never wanted to sing. David Porter, the songwriter who never understood who Johnnie was. As one of the leading songwriters and producers at Stax Records, David Porter, alongside Isaac Hayes, was behind countless hits for major artists like Sam and Dave Carla Thomas and the Soul Children. But when it came to Johnnie Taylor, Porter seemed to apply the same formula to a man who was anything but typical. The setting was the early 1970s post-Who's Making Love, a time when Johnnie was trying to prove he was more than just a one-hit singer. He wanted to go deeper to explore soul songs with rich emotional depth, the kind of material rooted in his gospel training. But the songs David Porter handed him went in the opposite direction. Slow-burning blues tracks, steady and sorrowful, with little room for emotional release, and above all lacking the gospel spirit that made Johnnie Taylor so distinct. Johnnie once spoke of that period with subtle sarcasm. "I felt like I was singing songs written for someone else wearing the wrong suit." Tracks like Steal Away Next Time and Somebody's Sleeping in My Bed, while well-structured and lyrically strong, felt like roles Johnnie was performing, not living. In the studio, he delivered. On stage, the audience still clapped. But inside, Johnnie felt himself drifting away from who he really was. His response wasn't explosive or rebellious. He didn't refuse to record. He didn't publicly criticize Porter. But after a few collaborations, Johnnie quietly stepped away from the Hayes-Porter writing circle and began working more with newer voices like Homer Banks and Betty Crutcher, writers who seemed to listen more and impose less. Perhaps sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from mistreatment, but from being misunderstood, or worse, from not being truly seen. Johnnie didn't resent David Porter, but he also never chose to collaborate with him again. Tyrone Davis, the close friend who turned away after one drunken night. In the soul world of the 1970s and 80s, Johnnie Taylor and Tyrone Davis were often mentioned in the same breath, not only because they both delivered heartfelt, emotionally rich R&B hits, but also because of the special bond they shared, both on stage and behind the scenes. They toured together many times through the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues for black performers during segregation. They shared stage lights, audience cheers, late dinners, and long road trips across states. But that friendship, once considered a rare camaraderie between two stars of the same era, shattered after a single night, and one mistake that couldn't be undone. It happened at a show in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 80s. Johnnie was exhausted, coming off a long run of demanding shows and dealing with personal issues. According to a backstage crew member, Johnnie arrived to the venue low-spirited and had been drinking heavily before going on stage. Once under the lights, he struggled forgetting lyrics, singing off-beat, even tripping as he moved across the stage. The crowd initially laughed it off, but soon came whispers of disappointment. Tyrone Davis, set to perform after Johnnie had to pick up the pieces. He gave an extra-spirited show to win the audience back and salvage the night. But behind the curtain, when the music stopped, it was sharp words that followed. Tyrone accused Johnnie of damaging their professional reputation, undoing the credibility they'd worked so hard to build. There were arguments, harsh words, and a fracture that would never be mended. Johnnie, though remorseful about the poor performance, couldn't accept Tyrone's reaction. He believed a true friend should have shown compassion and support in a moment of vulnerability, not used the stage as a place to express frustration. There was no public apology, no reconciliation dinner. They simply stopped appearing together, and fans gradually understood Johnnie and Tyrone had parted ways. Is friendship in the music world really that fragile? A little pride, one slip, one flawed performance? Can it erase years of laughter and shared moments? Johnnie Taylor rarely spoke about the incident afterward. But in songs like I Believe in You or Ain't That Lovin' You, you could hear a quiet ache, the kind of sorrow that comes when something in your belief in friendship quietly breaks. And when that belief began to crack, Johnnie once again turned back to memories, to the very first big friend in his life, both a mentor and a shadow he could never fully escape. The man who brought him into music, but also left him with a lifelong sense of being the one who came after. That man was Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke, the friend who was both a blessing and a burden. Johnnie Taylor first met Sam Cooke in the early 1950s, when he was still a young man singing in gospel groups across the South. Sam, already famous with the Soul Stirrers, saw in Johnnie an extraordinary potential, a voice rooted in the church, yet soft and smooth enough to cross into the secular world. Not long after, it was Sam himself who introduced Johnnie as his replacement in the Soul Stirrers when he left to pursue a solo career. It was a tremendous gift and an unnamed debt. Johnny stepped into that role with deep reverence, but he couldn't hide the feeling of being placed under an immense shadow. Audiences compared. Producers expected. Everyone wanted to know if this new guy was the next Sam Cooke. At early performances, people didn't come to hear Johnny. They came to see whether the man replacing Sam could possibly measure up. That pressure forced Johnny to build a kind of emotional armor. He sang flawlessly but cautiously. He accepted compliments but always knew they weren't fully meant for him. Later, when Sam founded his own label SAR Records, he continued to mentor Johnny, even producing his first solo recordings. But in 1964, Sam Cooke was fatally shot in a still-disputed incident, and for Johnnie Taylor it wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was the loss of his greatest spiritual anchor in a career now caught between gospel R&B and a mainstream music industry spinning fast into uncertainty. After Sam's death, Johnny was thrown into a kind of psychological limbo. He bounced from label to label, experimented with different genres, but was constantly labeled Sam Cooke's successor. Even when he released iconic hits like Cheaper to Keep Her Disco Lady or I Believe in You with a style entirely his own, articles and introductions still began with formerly replaced Sam Cooke in the Soul Stirrers. Johnny never blamed Sam, not once. But there was a quiet sadness in the way he spoke of those early days. In a 1998 interview, he said, "Sam was the first person who believed in me. And maybe that's why I've spent my whole life trying to prove who I am outside of his shadow." That story raises a timeless question. Can the support of a genius sometimes become an invisible chain? When you're placed into greatness too early, you might rise, but can you truly discover yourself? Johnnie Taylor spent decades stepping out from under Sam Cooke's shadow, not by denying the past, but by quietly walking his own path one step at a time, until Johnny meant something unmistakably his. But that shadow, though faded, never fully disappeared. John Richborg, John R., the powerful DJ who refused to play his music. During the golden era of Southern R&B, the name John Richborg, better known as John R., was among the most powerful voices in radio. With his deep, smooth tone charm and reputation built since the 1950s on Nashville's WLAC, John R. wasn't just a disc jockey, he was a gatekeeper. He decided who got airplay and who remained unheard. For Johnnie Taylor, a gospel-rooted artist from Arkansas, fighting to carve out a unique soul identity, John R.'s silence was not just a lack of support, it was rejection. And worse, it came without words, making it sting even more than open criticism. In the 1970s, as Johnny began rising with hits like Jody's Got Your Girl and Gone I Believe in You and Cheaper to Keep Her, he expected high-powered stations, especially WLAC, to help broadcast his music to the wider black audience across the South. But John R. rarely, if ever, played his songs, even as they climbed the Billboard R&B charts and sold millions. The reason was never clearly stated. But according to music historians of the Southern soul scene, John R. often favored artists deeply rooted in raw rural blues, or those personally connected to Nashville's music circles. By contrast, Johnnie Taylor, with his blend of gospel funk and more polished commercial soul, seemed too urban, too slick, and not roots enough for John R.'s taste. Johnny never publicly criticized John R. But in a later interview, when asked why he rarely performed in parts of the South, where WLAC had the strongest reach, he quietly replied, "There are places where my music wasn't welcome, not by the audience, but by the gatekeepers." How did Johnny respond? He kept working. He kept singing. He leaned on local DJs and independent stations where his voice was still valued. Yet the quiet exclusion from a system he was part of left a lasting scar. Not because he lacked talent, not because he lacked fans, but because one man with a microphone, one man with the power to choose, decided not to share his voice. For Johnnie Taylor, John R.'s silence didn't break him, but it remained a persistent wound. A reminder that sometimes, no matter how loud your voice, not everyone will choose to hear it. Little Milton Campbell. A friendship lost over a hit song for Johnnie Taylor. The music world wasn't just a stage for voice and feeling, it was also a brutal arena of choices. At times you had to decide, preserve a friendship or seize a life-changing opportunity. In one such moment, his friendship with Little Milton Campbell, one of the most beloved blues soul voices of the 60s and 70s, ended forever over a single track. Johnny and Little Milton were once close on the Southern performance circuit. They toured together in the tough years, shared backstage spaces, covered for each other when band members were missing or promoters failed to show. Milton, born in 1934 in Mississippi, had been one of the first artists signed to Chess Records, and later Stax. His thick, expressive blues voice made him stand out in an era gradually shifting toward commercial funk and soul. Meanwhile, Johnnie Taylor, still riding the momentum from Who's Making Love, was hunting for the next hit to cement his standing. And at that crossroads, both men set their sights on the same song, Cheaper to Keep Her. With its playful lyrics, catchy groove, and themes that resonated with middle-aged Southern men of the time, the song had clear hit potential. According to insiders, the demo was originally sent to both artists at once, neither given priority. Both showed interest, but Johnnie moved faster. He immediately called producer Tyrone Davis, requested to record the song first, and even reshuffled the track list of his upcoming album to make space for it. Milton was furious. Not because Johnnie stole the song, but because he felt betrayed. In showbiz, the unspoken rule was that close friends didn't step on each other's chances, especially if both could thrive on separate paths. Johnnie chose otherwise. He chose the hit. And indeed, Cheaper to Keep Her became one of his biggest commercial successes, landing in the top 5 on the Billboard R&B chart in 1973. It cemented his place as the philosopher of soul, the master storyteller of romance and regret. Milton. He never recorded the song. He continued his career with success, but never mentioned Johnnie again in interviews. They stopped performing together. No more backstage dinners. No more stories of the hard times they once endured side by side. Later, when asked about the incident, Johnnie gave a cryptic reply, "Music is business. And in business, the fastest one wins." It wasn't an apology, nor was it denial. It was just the harsh truth of the music industry. Behind every hit, there are invisible cuts to friendship, trust, and pride. Denise Lal, the queen of soul blues who once sparred backstage with him. At the height of his career, Johnnie Taylor wasn't just a golden voice of Southern soul. He was also a powerful figure behind the scenes, sometimes to the point where even strong-willed artists treaded lightly around him. But one of the few who dared to go toe-to-toe with words openly and without hesitation was none other than Denise Lal, the woman crowned as the Queen of Soul Blues. Denise and Johnnie Taylor operated within the same musical ecosystem, both signed to Malaco Records during the late 80s and 90s. Malaco had become a haven for legendary but forgotten artists, offering them a stage to continue performing for a loyal Southern Black audience. And within this world of veteran performers, the egos were just as formidable as the high notes they could hit. The incident occurred during a special concert night in Birmingham, Alabama, where both artists were slated to perform. Denise Lal, already a household name with hits like Trapped by a Thing Called Love and Now Run and Tell. That was scheduled to open the show while Johnnie Taylor was set to close. It was a placement that seemed obvious to many, but not to Denise, who saw it as a sign of disrespect. Backstage that night, tensions were already high due to technical glitches. Denise, known for her unfiltered honesty, voiced her frustration to the organizers. "No one should be automatically treated as the bigger star," she said, arguing that the audience came for both performers, not just one. Though she didn't name names, the comment reached Johnnie. According to a stagehand present that night, the two exchanged sharp words behind the curtains, intense enough that the show director had to step in and ask them to settle it after the show. Johnnie, long accustomed to headlining status, felt his credibility was being challenged. Denise, on the other hand, refused to accept that female performers, regardless of talent and success, should always place second to male headliners. The argument didn't last long, but it left behind a quiet rift between two artists who had once deeply respected each other's artistry. Johnnie's reaction after that night isn't fully documented, but in the years that followed, they never shared the stage again, though they continued to perform separately within the same tour circuits. Denise later alluded to the incident in her memoirs, calling it a classic example of artist egos clashing in a cramped space. This wasn't just a personal clash. It reflected a deeper truth about the music industry, how female artists, even those with undeniable talent and acclaim, were often relegated to supporting roles behind their male counterparts. For Denise, it was a declaration that voice has no gender, and neither should the right to shine. For Johnnie, it was a rare moment where he had to reconsider his position, not from the height of his fame, but from the standpoint of equality. Is it possible that fame, when not shared fairly, becomes a wall between artists who once stood side by side? As we close the chapter on the names that hurt, challenged, or weighed on Johnnie Taylor's heart for years, what remains isn't bitterness, but a fully human portrait. a portrait of an artist who lived between love and resentment rivalry, and admiration, personal ambition, and the intricate dynamics of the 20th century black music community. And perhaps it was precisely those tensions, however painful, that shaped Johnnie Taylor into the sharp, unfiltered, unforgettable figure he remained until his very last day. If you found this story memorable, please like the video to support the channel and subscribe so you won't miss more deep dives into music history. Is there a musician or figure you'd like to learn more about? Comment below. They just might be the next voice we uncover.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.